A gentle bear leads rangers to an injured hiker. What happens after the rescue will amaze you. The morning air clung to the mossy bones of the forest, damp and laced with the scent of rain that had not yet fallen. In Evergreen National Park, nestled in the wilds of the Pacific Northwest, spring arrived like a cautious visitor, testing the air with gentle breezes and the occasional blossom, but unwilling to fully dislodge winter's lingering chill. Ranger Jack Emerson stood on the porch of his weathered cabin, tin mug in hand, steam curling from his coffee like the breath of the mountains themselves. At 62, Jack was a man shaped by solitude and the quiet rhythms of nature. His face was as creased as the bark of the towering cedars behind him, his hands calloused and firm from years of gripping hiking poles and radio dials. He had spent decades walking in this land, watching its seasons shift like pages in a book only he could read. And yet, for all that familiarity, something felt wrong. It was the second morning in a row she had appeared. A black bear, young but large enough to command caution, stood motionless just beyond the tree line. She wasn't foraging. She wasn't passing through. She was watching. Jack lowered his mug slowly, every instinct in his body alert. The bear's dark eyes were fixed on him, not with hunger, not with fear, but with something that unnerved him more deeply, awareness. The wind moved through the trees, stirring the scent of pine and wet stone, and still she stood. Then, as if by cue, she turned and vanished into the brush. The first time he'd seen her, he chalked it up to coincidence. Perhaps she was simply lost or curious. But the second morning, and then the third, this was not coincidence. On the third day, when she came again, early in the pale hush just before sunrise, Jack was already waiting. She emerged from the forest with the same deliberate calm, her black fur silvered by dew, her breath misting in the crisp air. Jack stepped off his porch, moving slowly, his boots crunching the frost-hardened ground. He didn't speak. He simply watched her, and she watched him, something old and unspoken passing between them, like wind between trees. And then, without warning, she turned and walked into the forest. Jack followed. He didn't pack a full kit, just a first aid pouch, his radio, a flask of water, and a thermos of coffee. He didn't know what he expected to find, but some quiet part of him knew that if he ignored this, if he stayed behind, he would regret it for the rest of his life. She moved fast but not far ahead, keeping within sight, pausing every so often to glance back. The terrain grew steep and rugged, the trail had long since surrendered to time. Jack pushed past ferns as tall as his chest and ducked beneath moss-laden limbs. He knew these woods, at least, he thought he did. But this felt different, like stepping into someone else's dream. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher behind a thin veil of clouds. The forest narrowed into a ravine, steep-walled and cold. Jack hesitated at the edge of a ridge, heart pounding with exertion and something deeper, older. Luna. He didn't know when the name had come to him, but it felt right. She stood at the crest, staring down into the gorge below. When Jack reached her side, she took one long look into his eyes and then disappeared into the underbrush, leaving him alone with the silence. He looked down and froze. Below, tangled in the shadows and pine needles, lay the body of a man. Jack's training took over before the shock could sink in. He scrambled down the slope, his boots slipping on wet rock. The man was unconscious, barely breathing. One arm twisted unnaturally beneath him. Jack dropped to his knees and checked for a pulse, faint but there. Frostbite was evident on his fingertips, and dried blood matted the hair at his temple. The radio on Jack's belt crackled as he called for medevac assistance, giving coordinates with clinical precision, But his mind reeled. Who was this man? How had he gotten here? The chopper arrived hours later, the thud of its blades scattering birds into the sky. Paramedics loaded the man into a stretcher, faces grim as they assessed his condition. Jack stayed behind, staring at the ridge. Luna was gone. Not a twig stirred. He felt the weight of her absence like a closing door. The hospital in the nearby town of Clearwater was small but efficient. Jack visited 2 days later, half expecting to find the bed empty. But the man, Ethan Cole, was still there, pale and bruised, his arm in a cast, for trailing from his hand. Jack introduced himself. Ethan smiled weakly. "Ranger," he rasped, voice raw from dehydration. "I owe you everything." Jack shook his head. "Don't thank me. Thank the bear." Ethan blinked, then his eyes welled with tears. "She found me." Jack frowned. "You know her?" Ethan nodded slowly, painfully. "Years ago, I was working with a sanctuary up in Montana. There was a cub. We named her Luna. Poachers had killed her mother. I raised her for 2 years. She was too young to release at first, but eventually, we got her back into the wild, tagged her, let her go." His voice broke. "I never thought I'd see her again." Jack sat down heavily. "She remembered you." Ethan nodded, eyes distant. "I slipped down that ravine trying to photograph a wolf den. I was out for 2 days. I thought I was done, but I remember I heard her. A low grunt. I looked up, and she was there, right at the edge, watching. She didn't leave." Jack stared at the floor, mind spinning. In all his years in the field, he had seen many things: bear cubs clinging to fallen angel trees, elk mourning their dead, wolves howling in the dark. But never had he seen something like this. A bear remembering a human, seeking him, saving him. It upended everything he thought he knew. The textbooks called it instinct, survival, territory. But this? This was something else. Compassion. Recognition. Love. Outside the hospital window, snow flurried gently in the late light, tracing ghostly lines through the trees. Jack rose and gripped Ethan's hand. "You rest. When you're stronger, we'll talk more." As he turned to leave, Ethan called out, "She saved me because once I saved her." Maybe animals don't forget kindness. Maybe they remember better than we do. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. The fire in his cabin crackled low as the storm rolled in, wind sighing through the eaves. He sat by the window, cup in hand, eyes fixed on the dark woods beyond. Somewhere out there, Luna moved through the forest she had claimed again, wild and free. And though she had no words, she had spoken louder than most ever could. And Jack listened. The weeks that followed unfolded like mist over pine needles, quiet, persistent, heavy with questions. Jack returned to his patrols, but the rhythm had changed. Each path he walked, each ridge he crested, bore the lingering presence of what he had witnessed. A bear, once raised by human hands, had remembered that bond and crossed the boundary of instinct to save the one who had once saved her. It haunted him in the best and worst ways, stirring a reverence he hadn't felt since his early ranger days. Every rustle in the underbrush drew his eyes to the shadows. Every claw mark on tree bark made his breath catch. He hadn't seen Luna again, but she was there. He could feel it, watching, waiting. No longer a stranger in the woods, but a quiet guardian of something sacred. Ethan Cole, meanwhile, remained at the hospital, his recovery slow but steady. Word of his rescue spread quietly at first, whispers among rangers, murmurs through town. But it wasn't long before the story caught fire. Local papers called it a miracle. Wildlife forums buzzed with speculation, a bear who remembered, who acted with what some dared to call empathy. Skeptics rolled their eyes, but others leaned closer to the tale, hungry for something true, strange, and beautiful in a world too often dulled by cruelty. Jack kept most of it to himself. He wasn't one for dramatics. But when the doctors said Ethan was well enough for visitors, Jack returned, not just out of duty, but out of annoying curiosity that refused to quiet. Ethan was propped up in bed, his arms still in a sling, a laptop open in front of him, and his eyes red-rimmed from hours of scrolling through hundreds of photos. "Looking for her," he said when Jack asked. "I've got camera trap footage from a year ago. I think she's got cubs now." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You sure it's her?" Ethan gave a tired smile. "There's a scar on her right ear. She got it trying to climb a fence when she was a cub. I sewed it up myself." He paused. "I was a wreck back then, 24, angry at the world, too stubborn to stay out of fights I couldn't win. But she calmed something in me. I thought I was saving her. Maybe she was saving me." Jack didn't reply, but he sat down in the chair beside the bed, nodding once. Ethan turned the screen toward him. "Here, this was taken 6 weeks ago in the northern quadrant of the park. Same eyes, same walk, and those are definitely cubs." Jack studied the photo. The bear stood near a fallen cedar, 2 smaller shapes nestled at her side. Her eyes were clear, almost human. "Luna." There was no doubt. "Why were you in the ravine?" Jack asked. Ethan leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Tracking poacher signs. There have been strange patterns, motionless zones where bear populations that used to thrive found baited scent trails leading toward private land bordering the park." Jack's expression hardened. "Illegal hunting. Worse," Ethan said. "Selective elimination. Someone's trying to clear predators from specific corridors." "Why would anyone do that?" Jack didn't need to ask. The park had long been eyed by developers, especially the northern ridges rich with timber and mineral deposits. If bears and wolves disappeared, the land would be reclassified, easier to sell, easier to exploit. He stood, tension knotting in his shoulders. "We need to look into this." "There's more," Ethan said. "I kept a journal, recorded everything, coordinates, camera tags, trail patterns. I gave a copy to Rachel." "Rachel?" Jack turned. "My sister. We haven't talked in years," Ethan admitted. "She's an environmental attorney now. I thought maybe if something happened to me, she'd know what to do." Jack nodded slowly. "Smart." Ethan glanced toward the window. "I think Luna knew. I think she saw something. Maybe even who shot her." Jack stiffened. "Shot?" Ethan nodded grimly. "She's limping in the footage. Front shoulder." I zoomed in. "There's blood. Not from a fight. It's clean, like a grazing wound. She was hurt while protecting her cubs." Jack's mind whirled. A bear shot on protected land. A rescue that might not have been random. A man nearly dying at the edge of that same story. He knew what he had to do. 2 days later, Rachel Cole arrived in Evergreen in a dusty blue Subaru. Her jaw set with the grim focus of someone used to fighting uphill battles. She was younger than Ethan by 5 years but carried herself like a general in court, ready for armor, dark blazer, hiking boots, laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She and Ethan embraced awkwardly. The years of silence between them filled more with pain than malice. Jack watched from the side as the siblings spoke in hushed tones, then joined them as Rachel laid out the documents Ethan had sent her. "There's a pattern here," she explained, her finger tracing a line across a map of the park. Ninghe logged as near known logging stakes and mineral test plots, most of them owned by Northern Horizon Developments. Jack's eyes narrowed. "They're not supposed to have access to this land." "Not yet," Rachel said, "but if the predators disappear, the legal barriers fall." Ethan spoke quietly. "Luna's trying to survive in a war she doesn't even understand. And she still stopped to save me." Jack felt something shift deep in his chest, a thrum of anger, yes, but also awe. They would fight not just for Ethan, not just for the law, but for Luna. For what she proved. Dr. Henry Malaloy joined the team next, a gentle voice, biologist from the Montana sanctuary where Luna had been raised. He brought research papers, behavioral data, and a look in his eyes that suggested he already knew what most people wouldn't believe. "Bears remember," he said softly. "We've always suspected. There's evidence of root memory, seasonal recall, even social ties. But Luna, she's something else. She's remembering a person, an emotion." Rachel nodded. "That kind of memory challenges the very way we define wild." Over the next weeks, the group gathered footage, filed legal challenges, and contacted whistleblowers. Jack found old trail cameras hidden beneath ferns near logging sites, and in 2 separate cases, they recorded men in camouflage suits leaving out poison bait. Ethan's journal, paired with Luna's tracking collar data, painted a devastating map of disrupted bear territory. They submitted it all to the state commission. Public interest exploded when local news aired an interview with Jack and Ethan, timid, reluctant, raw. But the real storm broke when Luna was spotted again. This time, in daylight, limping but alive, her cubs trailing her like shadows. A live stream set up by wildlife rangers captured her emergence from the underbrush. Her wounded gait was unmistakable. The footage went viral. Millions watched as she turned toward the camera, nose lifted to the wind. The comments flooded in, "She remembers. She came back. We must protect her." Jack stood beneath the pines that evening, the sky burning orange with sunset. Somewhere nearby, a bear moved through the shadows, not with fear but with purpose. He thought of the old stories of animals that warned of fire, of wolves that mourned their dead, and now of a bear who remembered, who chose compassion, and who, despite her wounds, walked on. The forest no longer breathed in silence. It whispered, it stirred, it rallied. What began as a miracle in the shadows of the pines had grown into a movement, like roots cracking through concrete, slow, insistent, unstoppable. Luna's story had pierced the quiet soul of Evergreen, unearthing not just the bond between a man and a bear, but the fragile threads connecting all things wild and human. Jack Emerson stood before a crowd that filled the small amphitheater near the ranger station. The same one that once hosted sleepy summer talks about elk migrations and tree rings. Now it pulsed with the energy of hundreds, locals, hikers, students, ranchers, even strangers drawn by a story they didn't fully understand but deeply believed in. Jack adjusted the brim of his ranger's cap, cleared his throat, and let the silence settle over the crowd before speaking. A bear walked out of the woods and remembered a man. She led us to him. She didn't have to, but she did. And that tells me something we can't ignore. That's something wild. Something we've told ourselves is driven only by instinct, chose compassion. The words hung in the air, thick as pine resin. Behind him, Rachel Cole stepped forward with a legal folder clutched in her hand. Her voice was clear and sharp. "We've filed suit against Northern Horizon Developments and several local officials involved in fast-tracking land deals in protected territory. This isn't just about one bear. It's about every bear, every wolf, every piece of wild land that can't defend itself with anything but silence. And we won't let that silence be used against them." The crowd stirred. Applause broke out. It wasn't a roar, not yet. But it was the beginning. Luna, still limping but healing, had been spotted days earlier near the Alder River, her cubs flanking her like dusk and dawn. Wildlife rangers tracked her cautiously, placing no pressure on her movement but ensuring her collar continued to transmit vital data. And that data, once just a stream of numbers and blips, was telling a story too bold to ignore. Dr. Henry Malaloy had set up a small mobile lab in the back of his SUV, poring over the GPS trail that mapped Luna's path since her rescue of Ethan. "She's not just surviving," he told Jack one evening as rain tapped against the roof of the lab like fingertips on a drum. "She's coordinating movement between safe corridors, avoiding human settlements, and sheltering her cubs in terrain we didn't even think they favored." He pointed to a cluster of points on the screen. "And this," he said, "she backtracked after her injury, returned to one of the sites we suspect the poachers used." Jack leaned in. "You think she was looking for something?" Malloy's eyes were tired but alive with wonder. "I think she's watching, learning, warning others. Maybe we've observed wolves do it. Crows, dolphins, but a bear." Jack said nothing, but deep inside he felt it, an ancient shiver of recognition, like the memory of a dream that hadn't yet faded. The local community, once wary of predators, began to shift. It started with small things, signs posted on trails to alert hikers of active bear territory, neighborhood discussions about trash storage and livestock protection. Then Ben Walker, a rugged outfitter who had once boasted of hunting wolves to protect his cattle, stood at a town meeting and held up a photograph. It was Luna, caught on his trail cam, standing tall against the slope of Copper Ridge, her eyes fixed on the lens. "She could have taken my calf," Ben said, his voice gruff but steady. "She was close, but she didn't. She passed through, quiet, respectful, and that made me think maybe it's time we showed some respect too." A murmur swept through the room. Respect, not fear, not dominance. Something mutual, something new. From that spark, the Luna Network was born, a citizen science initiative that invited locals and visitors alike to report wildlife sightings, share trail conditions, and contribute to non-lethal wildlife management efforts. Drones were repurposed for monitoring rather than harassment. Trail cams were used to map movement patterns, not trap lines. Kids learned to track prints in the mud and upload them to a shared database, marveling at the paths that wove their town into the larger story of the park. Jack, though hesitant at first, found himself mentoring a group of high schoolers who had once considered the woods just a backdrop. Now they moved through it like apprentices, whispering to trees, asking questions with reverence. One afternoon, as they crossed a meadow where Luna had been seen nursing her cubs, one of the boys, Liam, stopped and crouched low. "Look," he whispered, pointing to the muddy bank of a nearby stream. There, perfectly pressed into the earth, was the unmistakable print of a bare paw. Fresh. "She was here," Liam breathed. "Today." Jack knelt beside him, tracing the outline with a gloved finger. "And she left it for us to find, as if to say, I'm still here. I see you too." Meanwhile, the legal battle deepened. Rachel faced opposition from all angles, pressure from local officials who claimed she was disrupting the economy, threats from anonymous sources urging her to drop the case. But she pressed on when documents leaked showing direct correspondence between Northern Horizon executives and two park commissioners, emails that detailed plans to remove high-risk predator species. Public outrage ignited like dry tinder. Protesters gathered outside government buildings with signs that read, "She remembers, so do we," and "Protect the wild that protects us." Families came forward with stories of animals they'd encountered, foxes that returned each winter, owls that nested outside nurseries, a cougar that once shielded a child lost in the woods from coyotes. The lines between myth and science began to blur in the most beautiful ways. And then came the day Luna re-emerged fully. Her limp mostly gone, her coat thick and glinting with health. She appeared near a ranger camera at dawn. The live stream captured her stepping into a clearing, pausing. Her cubs were wrestling gently behind her. She stood there for nearly a full minute, staring at the lens, the early light catching in her eyes like fire caught in obsidian. Across the country, millions watched in silence. Children pressed to screens. Elders wept quietly. Scientists took notes, but not before sitting in awe. In that moment, Luna was not just a bear. She was a memory, a truth, a question, and an answer. That night, the town gathered again, but this time, not in anger or fear. Jack spoke only briefly, his voice softer than usual. "She's not just part of this forest. She's part of us now. And we are part of her story." Then he stepped back, and the crowd lit candles, hundreds of tiny flames flickering like stars under the pine canopy. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Their silence said everything. And deep in the woods, a black bear paused on a ridge, ears flicking toward the light that danced beneath the trees. Her cubs pressed close, watching her. She did not run. She did not roar. She simply stood still and proud and watched the humans, remembering what they had forgotten. That wildness does not mean savagery. That memory is not only for those who speak. And that, in the heart of the forest, a bear had chosen kindness once again. The collar released with a soft click just past dawn, falling gently from Luna's neck into the underbrush where frost still clung to the ferns. It was designed to detach after 1 year, quietly, without disruption. But the timing felt more poetic than planned. Somewhere behind her, nestled deeper into the mist-veiled forest, her cubs rustled beneath a pine. They had grown strong, no longer the fragile creatures who once trembled at her side, but confident shapes of muscle and curiosity, shaped by a year of freedom, a year of lessons. Luna stood still for a moment, feeling the absence of the collar like the lifting of a memory that had never been hers to carry. She sniffed the air, turning her head toward the mountain ridge where the wind moved clean and sharp and wild. A nearby camera trap blinked, catching a single frame, the bear with the silver ear scar lifting her head to the sky, unbound once again. In clear water, Jack Emerson watched that footage on his old desktop, a coffee gone cold in his hand, and the morning light creeping across his office floor. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just breathed deeply, slowly, and let the quiet settle into his bones like ash after a fire. He had spent 3 decades patrolling the edges of wildness, believing his duty was containment, guiding humans away from danger, pushing nature back into its lanes. But Luna had unraveled that belief, fiber by fiber, until only something softer remained: respect, awe, responsibility. Across town, the Evergreen Wildlife Education Center opened its doors for the first time to the public. Where once there had been hesitation, even protest, now there was anticipation. Children spilled through the doors with wide eyes, greeted not by taxidermy or warnings, but by living stories. Interactive maps that track Luna's migration, digital exhibits showing bear family dynamics, short documentaries capturing Ethan Cole's recovery and return to the forest he nearly died in. In the center of the main hall stood a life-sized sculpture of Luna, cast in black and bronze, her scar delicately carved, her cubs trailing behind her in a quiet procession. Beneath the sculpture were etched the words, "She remembered. So did we." Ethan stood just beyond the sculpture, a clean camera slung across his chest. His right arm, once broken, was now fully healed, though a slight tremor remained when he lifted it for too long. But the tremor didn't bother him. It reminded him that his life had been caught and returned by something that had no reason to care for him except one: she remembered. He clicked photos with reverence, documenting visitors not as subjects but as participants in a growing story. Children pressing hands to the touchscreen, elderly hikers sharing trail encounters, rangers explaining how to read paw prints in the dirt. His sister, Rachel, walked the halls with calm purpose, a clipboard tucked under her arm, dressed not in courtroom black but in jeans and boots that bore the dirt of morning trails. The lawsuit had concluded weeks earlier. The judgment, a victory that still rang like thunder through the state's legal landscape. Permanent habitat protections were enacted across 5 counties. Predator corridors were not only restored but expanded, with funding allocated for non-invasive monitoring. Officials involved in the poaching cover-ups faced indictment, and several developers withdrew entirely, citing public pressure and legal complications. But more than the win, it was the shift in tone that mattered most. Local ranchers partnered with researchers to test bear-safe fencing. High school students formed wilderness clubs that conducted wildlife observations and sent data to the Luna network. Former skeptics, like Ben Walker, became speakers at conservation events, their voices carrying the weight of hard-earned change. Jack, though not one for public speaking, gave one final address at the town hall, standing quietly before a crowd larger than any he had ever seen. "You've heard the story," he said, "of how a bear remembered a man. But I think what matters more is that we remembered her, not as a curiosity, not as a threat, but as kin, as someone whose story deserves to continue." No applause followed his words, not right away, just silence, the good kind, the kind that listens, the kind that honors. And far from town, in the northernmost reach of the park, where the trees grew ancient and untouched, Luna crossed a stream with her cubs in tow. Their fur shimmered with youth and strength, their paws sure against the rocky earth. She led them not just toward food or shelter but into deeper wildness, where no collar could reach, where no threat lingered. And if a trail camera flickered nearby, she gave it no notice. Her part in the human world was done. She had taught them what they needed to know. A month later, Rachel received a letter handwritten in the neat cursive of an older man who lived in the next county over. He was a retired trapper, once proud of his trade, but he'd seen the live stream, and something had shifted. "I spent 40 years removing bears," the letter read. "I never thought to watch one protect. I didn't know they could choose to forgive. I didn't know they could remember." That line struck her the hardest. I didn't know they could remember. It wasn't just a bear who had changed things. It was the idea that wildness was not a blank slate of instinct but a vast, mysterious landscape of memory, emotion, and choice. In her final media interview before stepping back from public life, Rachel said simply, "We learned from Luna. We learn that we are not the only ones who can choose to care. Meanwhile, Jack returned to his trails not out of duty, but love. He wore no badge now, only a pack. And when hikers passed, they recognized him not as the ranger, but as the man who followed the bear. Sometimes they asked if he ever saw her again. He'd smile, shake his head, and point to the trees. She doesn't need to be seen, just remembered. On his last hike of the season, he paused at a familiar ridge, the same one where Luna had once disappeared into the trees after showing him Ethan's broken body in the ravine below. The snow was thin now, just a lacework across the ferns. A single bare print marked the trail ahead, not fresh, not new, but unmistakable. Jack crouched beside it, laid his hand in the hollow where Luna's paw had pressed into the earth. And for the first time in a long while, he whispered a thank you, not for the miracle, not even for the man she saved, but for the reminder that memory lives where love once stood. That wildness is not the absence of feeling but the place where feeling begins again. That sometimes, when the world forgets itself, it takes a bear to help it remember. Snow fell like memory over the ridges of evergreen, not in sheets but in slow, deliberate flurries that drifted through the air like pieces of something unfinished. It had been over a year since Luna had last been seen by human eyes. And though her image still adorned the signs at the Evergreen Wildlife Education Center and the children's storybooks lining the library shelves, she had returned fully to the forest, leaving only silence and awe in her wake. But silence was never empty. Not here. It was where roots whispered secrets, where water remembered paths cut 100 winters ago, where every snapped twig and startled squirrel echoed with the presence of something greater. For Jack Emerson, the forest had become not a place to manage, but a place to listen. His official retirement had come and gone without much fanfare. Just a handshake from the superintendent, a framed photograph in a small gathering where Ethan, Rachel, and Dr. Malaloy offered quiet words over coffee and peanut cookies. But the truth was Jack had never really left. He still walked the trails, still paused at the bends where the wind changed, where Luna had once stood. He no longer wore a uniform, but the forest seemed to recognize him just the same. Animals didn't scatter like they used to. A fox once followed him for an hour. An owl called from the same branch at dusk for 3 days straight. And though Luna herself had not reappeared, there were signs, paw prints in fresh snow, claw marks too high for any cub, strands of black fur caught on the bark of a cedar halfway up the mountain. The locals had stopped asking if she was still out there. They just said her name with a reverence usually reserved for ancestors. She had become part of the forest fabric, part story, part truth, entirely real. At the education center, Ethan continued his work documenting wildlife behavior, but he spent more time mentoring now, teaching young photographers how to see with patience rather than urgency. He told them that the best image was the one not taken, that the most honest encounters often happen just after the camera was lowered. His own photos of Luna remained unpublished in the traditional sense. Instead, he curated them into a small exhibition titled The Eyes That Remember, housed in a quiet corner of the center where visitors moved slowly, whispering often, pausing for long stretches in front of a single image, Luna standing in the falling snow, her cubs barely visible in the shadows behind her, her gaze locked on the lens with that same inexplicable familiarity. Ethan never captioned that one. It needed no words. Rachel had returned to her legal work, but everything she touched now carried the spirit of Evergreen. She took on cases that others deemed too emotional, too rooted in the soft sciences of ecology and animal behavior. She cited Luna in courtrooms, once even showing the live stream to a panel of judges debating whether to allow new drilling near a remote wildlife corridor. They had ruled against the project unanimously. But even victories like that were tempered by the vastness of what still remained at risk. She knew that Luna's story was rare, not because animals lack memory or compassion, but because humans rarely slowed down long enough to notice. Still, something had shifted. The Luna network had expanded statewide, then nationally. Wildlife sightings flowed in from hikers, ranchers, truckers, even children riding school buses. What started as a tool for observation had become something more, a web of connection that stretched like mycelium beneath the surface of society, binding people to the places they once ignored. And now there was news. A new bear had been spotted in the southern part of the park. A large female with a distinctive silver scar on her right ear and 2 cubs at her side, older than before, more independent. The footage, captured by a biologist named Maria Langston, showed the bear foraging calmly beside a stream, the cubs playing nearby. When Maria uploaded the video to the Luna network, the response was immediate. Could it be? Was it really her? Jack had seen the clip only once, and he didn't question it. The tilt of her head, the rhythm of her stride. It was Luna, changed, older, but unmistakably herself, still leading, still watching, still here. And then, one late afternoon, as the sun bled into the snow-dusted horizon, Jack returned to the ridge. He hadn't planned it, hadn't told anyone he was going. He brought no equipment, no radio, no phone, only his breath, his boots, and a small carved token in his coat pocket, a wooden bear shaped by a child from one of the local schools, gifted to him during a class visit to the education center. The wind was gentle that day, the kind that curled around your shoulders rather than pushed. The trees whispered above him, tall and old and kind. He reached the place, the very spot where Luna had once vanished into the trees after showing him where Ethan lay broken in the ravine. The snow was thinner here, patches of earth peeking through like the forest exhaling after holding its breath all winter. Jack sat down on a fallen log, placed the wooden bear beside him, and closed his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just waited. And in that stillness, something moved. Not loud, not urgent, just a shift in the air, a change in weight. Jack opened his eyes slowly. Across the clearing, at the edge of the trees, she stood, Luna. Her fur was thicker, dusted with gray along her hunches, but her posture was unchanged, calm, regal, present. Her cubs, nearly grown now, lingered behind her, half curious, half cautious. But she stepped forward once. Just once. Jack didn't rise. He didn't reach. He simply looked at her and nodded, his breath catching in his throat. "Thank you," he said quietly, not expecting her to understand the words, but needing to say them anyway. Luna blinked slowly. Then she turned, not rushed, not afraid, just ready. She disappeared into the trees like a story returning to its roots. And Jack remained, heart thundering with something that wasn't fear or joy, but a deep, abiding peace. A week later, the wooden bear was found by a trail maintenance crew, still perched on the log, untouched, as if guarding something sacred. They left it there. No one ever moved it again. Years passed. The education center grew. A research grant was established in Luna's name, funding long-term studies on bear cognition and emotional behavior. Laws changed, hearts softened. A town once shaped by skepticism became a haven for stories like Luna's. And deep in the protected reaches of Evergreen, the bears lived on, wild, free, mysterious. But every so often, a hiker would return from the forest and say they felt something watching from the ridge, something calm and curious. They would speak of a black shape in the trees, a scar like a silver thread glinting in the light, and eyes that held memory like water holds the reflection of the sky. And those who knew, those who remembered, would smile and say, "That's her. That's the bear who remembered." Because in the end, it wasn't just Luna who had remembered. It was all of them, the ranger, the photographer, the sister, the town. The forest had kept the story safe until they were ready to listen. And when they finally did, it changed them forever.